Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and with me is our expert. We're both cybersecurity specialists from Armada Cyber Defense.
That's right. And here at Armada Cyber Defense, we spend a lot of time helping organizations just like yours figure out these complex cybersecurity compliance requirements.
Yeah, and a really big piece of that puzzle right now for many is CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification.
Mhm.
We regularly handle CMMC gap assessments, helping folks see where they stand and then guiding them through the remediation.
It can definitely be a challenge.
Absolutely. But underpinning CMMC and, frankly, a lot of other frameworks is a core concept we're diving into today, really understanding system boundaries.
Hmm.
We're going to look at this mainly through the lens of cloud services, and we've got some great source material like a job aid on agency authorization boundaries and also some detailed FedRAMP guidance.
So our mission for this deep dive really is to clarify this idea of the authorization boundary, especially how it works for cloud services in, let's say, regulated spaces like the federal government.
Right, whether you're dealing with FedRAMP directly or maybe CMMC is your focus, getting this boundary right is, well, it's fundamental.
It absolutely is. You can't really move forward effectively without it.
Exactly. So we'll unpack the key ideas, some rules of thumb from these documents, hopefully giving you a much clearer picture of how to define these boundaries for your own systems. Okay, so let's kick things off. What exactly are we talking about when we say authorization boundary?
Well, the official definition coming from OMB Circular A130 says it includes all components of an information system to be authorized for operation by an authorizing official.
Okay, all components.
Right. And importantly, it specifically excludes any connected systems that are authorized separately. So if you connect to another system that has its own authorization, it's generally outside your boundary.
Got it. It's like drawing a really clear line around the specific system getting the thumbs up. Now, how does the FedRAMP guidance we looked at build on that definition?
Yeah, FedRAMP gets more specific for cloud. It says the boundary description needs to cover all the internal bits and pieces of the cloud system, and also how it connects to any external services or systems.
So internal and external connections?
Critically, yes. It has to account for the entire journey of any federal information and also all the related metadata, data about the data as it moves through that cloud service offering.
It sounds like it's less about just the tech itself and more about tracing the data. Where does it start? Where does it go? What touches it?
You've nailed it. The authorization boundary diagram, which is a key part of this, is basically a picture showing what the cloud service provider, the CSP, actually controls.
A visual scope of control.
Exactly. And it also has to clearly show any parts of the system or services that are pulled in from outside external services or maybe parts that the customer themselves control.
Okay, that makes sense. So why is defining this boundary so important? It sounds like it could take some real effort.
Oh, it's absolutely critical, foundational, really, for a few big reasons. First, like we said, it's that visual map, a diagram showing all the internal stuff, the components, how they link up externally. It gets everyone on the same page about what's in scope.
You know that old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words? I can see how that clarity would be incredibly valuable with complex systems.
It really is. Second, it's vital because it forces you to account for all federal information, the data itself, plus its metadata as it moves through that cloud service offering, or CSO.
Right, you can't protect what you don't know you have or where it's going.
Precisely. And you mentioned frameworks earlier. This boundary concept is a cornerstone in key documents like NIST SP 800-37, which is the Risk Management Framework, RMF.
The RF, yeah.
And also OMB A130, Managing Federal Info Resources. These are big deals in federal cybersecurity.
So it's baked into the core requirements.
Definitely. And furthermore, any connections inside that boundary, they get heavily scrutinized by the agency authorizing officials, the AOs. They need absolute confidence that federal data and metadata are properly protected everywhere within that line.
Okay, so the boundary basically sets the playing field for all the security checks that follow. Now, inside that boundary, you mentioned some key terms. Let's start with federal information. What does that cover?
Right. So OMB A130 defines federal information very broadly. It's basically any information created, collected, processed, maintained, shared, or disposed of by or for the federal government. Doesn't matter the format or medium.
So pretty much anything the government touches, information-wise. How does FedRAMP narrow that down or apply it in a cloud context?
FedRAMP is super clear. Any federal data that a federal customer puts into or generates within, the cloud service offering has to be inside the authorization boundary.
Okay, customer data is in.
Yes, and crucially, this includes not just the obvious data entries, but also the metadata associated with it.
Metadata. Data about data.
Yeah.
Sometimes feels like the hidden details that can trip you up, right?
Exactly, and it often gets missed, which is why the guidance calls it out. FedRAMP breaks metadata into two main types here. First, there's data describing the customer's data. Think activity logs for that specific tenant, or maybe XML files generated based on customer inputs.
Okay, logs and configuration type stuff.
Sort of. The second type is information that could impact the system's confidentiality, integrity, or availability. The good old CIA triad.
The security posture itself.
Right. This includes system-wide logs, audit trails, vulnerability scan, reports anything about the system's health or security status that relates to protecting that federal data.
So even a system log file becomes federal information if it pertains to a federal customer's use or the security protecting their data. That clicks.
Precisely. And the guidance stresses all this metadata needs to be accounted for. It needs to be protected just like the primary data, and it has to be documented clearly in your FedRAMP package.
Okay, federal data and metadata are firmly inside the line. Now, systems inside the boundary need to talk to each other. What about interconnections?
Good transition. NIST SP 847 Rev 1 defines an interconnection as basically a direct link between two or more IT systems specifically set up to share data or resources.
Makes sense. Systems connecting to share things.
Yeah, and our FedRAMP source actually notes that this definition is being updated to explicitly mention the exchange of information, which is usually the whole point.
Right, they don't just connect for fun. How does FedRAMP look at these internal cloud connections?
Well, the FedRAMP guidance highlights that authorizing officials really scrutinize these interconnections. They need to be sure that federal data and metadata are safe wherever they move within the system.
Okay, so internal data movement is key.
And cloud systems rely heavily on these connections, right? Often using APIs, application programming interfaces, or other ways systems talk to each other, maybe synchronously or asynchronously. All these pathways could potentially transmit federal data or metadata.
So the risk is inherent in the connection.
Potentially, yes. And the critical thing is, all these connections and any risks they might introduce have to be fully disclosed to the authorizing official. It's all about transparency in the documentation.
Transparency is key. Got it. Now, switching gears slightly, what about services the cloud system uses but aren't really part of its core offering? This is where external services fit in, right?
Exactly. NIST SP 800-53 defines these as system services implemented outside the main system's authorization boundary. Typically, they're services where your organization doesn't have direct control over the security controls or how they're assessed.
So maybe like using a third-party service for identity management, or perhaps a separate content delivery network, a CDN.
Those are perfect examples. And the FedRAMP guidance says if a CSP uses these external systems or services to, help their own offering work better, they must tell the authorizing official about them, clearly.
Tell them, and what else?
They also need to explain how much federal information, the actual data, might be affected by using these external services. This all needs to be laid out in the FedRAMP authorization package, the SSP, SAP, SAR, all those documents.
Okay, document the dependencies. And I remember seeing a really important point in the sources about external services that impact CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability.
Yes, this is a super important distinction. The guidance is very clear. Any external service that impacts the CIA of federal information must be included within the cloud service offering's boundary.
So it's not enough just to mention it if it touches security.
Correct. If it interacts with federal data or metadata in a way that could affect its security, it's effectively part of the system that needs authorization. It gets pulled inside the boundary line security-wise.
That's a major line in the sand. Now, what if that external service has already got its own FedRAMP approval? Our sources call these leveraged external services.
Right. So if your service uses an external service that already has its own FedRAMP authorization, you might be able to sort of piggyback on some of their compliance work for certain controls.
That sounds helpful.
It can be. But you still have to fully document this relationship in your FedRAMP package, especially the system security plan and the control implementation summary. It's still technically external, but it comes with that FedRAMP seal of approval, which can definitely streamline parts of your own assessment.
Okay, helps, but doesn't remove the need for documentation. Now, flipping the coin. What kinds of services are usually outside the boundary? The sources mentioned corporate services.
Yeah, corporate services are described as a specific type of external service in the FedRAMP guidance. These are the systems a cloud service provider uses for its own internal day-to-day business operations.
Like HR systems or maybe their main marketing website.
Exactly. The key things are they live outside the CSO's boundary, and critically, they don't contain any information that would impact the CIA of the CSO itself.
So their internal CRM, maybe a general support ticketing system,
Yeah.
billing systems.
Those are the examples given, yes, provided they don't handle any federal data or related metadata. If, say, the billing system contained details linked directly to federal usage in a sensitive way, then that caveat about impacting CIA could pull it back in.
Context matters. And there was that really interesting example about corporate email, wasn't there? Highlighting that nuance.
Yes, that's a perfect illustration. The guidance points out, imagine a CSP employee sends an email about a vulnerability found in the CSO using their regular corporate email.
Okay.
Well, because that vulnerability information is metadata that directly impacts the CSO's confidentiality and integrity, that corporate email system, or at least parts of it involved in that communication, might actually need to be considered inside the authorization boundary for assessment purposes.
Wow. So it's not just the type of system, but what information flows through it and why.
Exactly right. You have to look at the actual data flow and its security implications. Now, the sources also mention development environments potentially being outside. What's the deal there?
Right. Dev environments where they design, build, test code might be outside the boundary. The absolute key condition is they must not process, store, or transmit any federal information, period.
No federal data allowed in dev, basically.
If federal data touches those dev environments, even just for testing, they're almost certainly going to need to be brought inside the boundary and meet all the requirements.
And this loops back to interconnections again, doesn't it? How dev talks to production.
Absolutely. If there are any connections between a dev environment and the authorized production CSO boundary, those connections need to be transparent. You have to show them to the AO for review and risk acceptance.
And the AO might pull dev in.
Depending on what, if any, federal information flows across that connection, even accidentally, the AO could absolutely require the entire development environment to be included within the authorization boundary, subjecting it to full FedRAMP scrutiny. Okay, lots of nuances there. It feels like we could maybe boil this down to some simpler rules of thumb for what's generally in or out.
Yes, thankfully the guidance does offer some practical rules. Rule number 1 for inclusion. If it processes, stores, or transmits federal information, that's pretty much always in.
Okay, federal info means in. Rule 2.
Rule number 2, also for inclusion. Any external service that impacts the CIA of federal information. This includes services holding the data itself or services holding metadata that affects the security of that data.
Right, the CIA impact brings it in. What about the out rules?
Rule number 3, generally out. Corporate services that do not affect the CIA of federal information, as long as they stay separate and don't touch sensitive data, they're usually outside.
Usually out. Okay.
And the last one.
Rule number 4, also generally out. Development environments that do not process, store, or transmit federal information. But again, with that big asterisk about interconnections potentially changing things. These rules give a good starting point. Now, how do organizations actually show all this? Visualizing the boundary must be key.
Oh, definitely. The FedRAMP PMO, the Program Management Office, notes that data flow diagrams are really effective. Good diagrams show things like how a federal customer logs in.
Authentication.
Right. The logical path data takes through the system, what admins and support staff can access, how the application data moves within the boundary, and importantly, how data flows out to any connected or leveraged external systems.
And the job aid we have gives some visual examples, right, showing different perspectives.
Yes. There are sample network diagrams showing a view for the CSP's administrators, another for the customer's administrators, and one for the end users. You don't need to memorize every box and line. But they illustrate how you can visually map out the components and subnets making up the boundary from different viewpoints. It clarifies who touches what.
And I saw they include legends, too, to explain the symbols.
Yes, legends are crucial. They define what the symbols mean, the boundary line itself. Different network segments, specific components or services. These diagrams are invaluable for talking clearly with your assessors, the 3 PAOs, and the agency AO.
Okay, so visualization is critical.
Yeah.
Now, FedRAMP sets a baseline. But do agencies ever add their own requirements on top? What about agency-specific requirements?
That's a really important point. Yes, while FedRAMP provides that solid baseline based on impact level, federal agencies absolutely can and often do layer on additional security requirements.
Why would they do that?
Usually it's tied to their specific mission needs or the particular sensitivity of the data they handle.
So Agency A might need more controls than Agency B, even using the same FedRAMP service.
Precisely. These extras could be specific privacy controls beyond the baseline, maybe rules about handling data related to foreign nationals or other unique security factors.
So what's the advice for CSPs then?
Engage early and often. The FedRAMP PMO strongly advises CSPs to talk to their federal customers right from the start and keep talking to identify any of these agency-specific needs. They can definitely impact the boundary definition and the controls you need.
So communication prevents surprises later.
Exactly, and the PMO often tries to help align CSPs and agencies on these requirements too.
This has been super helpful for the FedRAMP context, but let's connect it back, especially for listeners maybe more focused on, say, the defense world.
Yeah.
How does all this boundary talk relate to CMMC?
Great question. Well, yeah, our sources were FedRAMP focused, the basic idea of defining a clear system boundary. It's just as critical, maybe even more so upfront, for CMMC.
How so?
Well, defining your scope is arguably the first real step in any CMMC gap assessment. You absolutely have to know what systems, what assets are involved in handling controlled unclassified information CUI.
So the boundary defines the CUI environment.
Precisely. Where does CUI live? Where is it processed? Where does it travel in your network? Answering those questions is defining your CMMC boundary or scope. The principles are incredibly similar to what we've discussed for FedRAMP.
So all this thinking about what's in, what's out, data flows.
Yeah.
It directly applies when figuring out your CMMC scope.
Exactly. And, this is right where we at Armada Cyber Defense come in to help organizations preparing for CMMC. Conducting CMMC gap assessments is core to what we do.
Right.
And a huge part of that assessment is working with you to properly define that system boundary based on how CUI flows through your specific environment. We help map that out accurately.
So you help draw that CMMC line.
We help you draw the line correctly, yes. And then, of course, once the assessment identifies gaps areas needing improvement to meet the CMMC requirements, we also provide the expert guidance and hands-on support for the remediation needed to get you compliant. A solid boundary definition is the bedrock for everything else in CMMC.
That's a critical link for anyone in the defense industrial base listening. So, wrapping up, it seems clear. Whether it's FedRAMP or CMMC, getting that authorization or system boundary defined clearly is non-negotiable.
Absolutely. Key takeaways. The boundary has to cover everything, processing sensitive info, federal data or CUI, or impacting its security. Pay close attention to external services, especially how they affect CIA, and understand the status of corporate and dev environments.
And being able to visualize it with clear diagrams isn't just nice to have, it's vital for communication and, frankly, for your own understanding.
Couldn't agree more. Getting these principles right isn't just about compliance paperwork. It's fundamental to actually securing your systems and protecting that sensitive information in today's threat landscape.
So if you are working through FedRAMP, or especially if you're gearing up for a CMMC assessment, really focus on nailing down your system boundary. It's the foundation for everything that follows. And remember, for CMMC specifically, the cybersecurity experts here at Armada Cyber Defense can provide that crucial assistance from conducting the gap assessment to defining that boundary accurately to guiding you through remediation.
Definitely. And maybe one final thought to leave you with. As you go back and look at your own environment, your own diagrams, are there any services you currently think of as external that, based on how they handle data or impact security, might actually need to be pulled inside your security boundary for proper protection and compliance? Maybe revisit those diagrams with a fresh, critical perspective. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.